cool to see you all in person and you all virtually, but
Yeah. Hey, okay. We can go ahead and get started. This might be a fairly quick meeting that's going to be recorded because I think a lot of folks are in Japan this week for ETH Tokyo. And this time zone is probably not the best for them. But we'll go ahead and get started with the topics on the list today. So a couple things. One, on the Farcaster developer updates, mainnet hubs are now live. So we have a bunch of them running. Thanks to everyone who's been operating a hub. I know AlphaCaster has been running one as well as a bunch of others. So that's actually been super helpful for us in getting things up and started. Second thing, we have a hub web released. So this is actually a new client for talking to hubs that you can use from a browser. For the most part, this works. There's a few issues that Paul's been tracking down with getting it to work correctly on Next.js and a couple other places, but this now lets you run hub apps or lets you talk directly to a hub from like a React front end or a single page application without needing a Node.js backend. So it's really nice for just like talking to stuff from browsers, which is something you can do with Ethereum and with Ethers and similar libraries. Sweet. The big thing that I wanted to focus on today was the what's next for Farcaster. And I shared this doc out and already got a bunch of comments async, but wanted to walk through this synchronously. So with hubs rolling out, we wanted to take a step back and say like, hey, what are the most important things for Farcaster and apps building on Farcaster? And I think there's a few different categories. So first one is we want to increase the number of people creating useful content on Farcaster. And useful content here is in the context of like not airdrop farming. Like there's no specific definition beyond that other than humans talking is good and bots talking to each other is less good as a metric for like, is the protocol growing or not? The second piece is increasing the number of developers building on Farcaster. I think users is the most important because if there's a lot of users, there's a lot of value for developers. But the next thing is make it easier for developers to keep building on the protocol and make it more accessible. Goal 3 is achieving credible neutrality. I think we're a good chunk of the way there with the launch of hubs, but we actually need our identity layer on a decentralized system in order to have credible neutrality. And the last one is make money to keep funding protocol development. Like right now, if you think of it purely from the perspective of Farcaster, the protocol actually needs a revenue stream so that it can keep incentivizing developers and other people talking about this stuff. Dan's behind me, so you don't get the peanut gallery commentary because he doesn't have his keyboard. In terms of the stack rank problems, here's how we're thinking about going about it, and we kind of want to get feedback from the other clients and people building on this. The first priority for us is we want to make sure that hubs are working as expected. So we want to make sure that hubs have launched and that we've hit our goal of 10 stable hubs that are running. And I think there's a couple of like small pieces that we need to focus on here, but one of them is we want like actual monitoring and tracking of like our hub staying in sync. Is all the data moving across the system effectively? If you post on Jam, is everything showing up within a certain amount of time on Farcaster? The second piece is most apps are reading from hubs, are not reading from hubs and only writing to hubs. And a lot of them still rely on Warpcast APIs for writing. So this area is a little untested, and we want to like help Discover, Jam, Yup, all the other apps building on Farcaster migrate from the Warpcast APIs to the hub APIs, which are a little bit more complex, but we actually think offer a greater level of decentralization and B, a close enough user experience that our developer experience that the migration should be straightforward. So we want to focus on getting all these apps moved over. And then we have high confidence that hubs are the right architecture for this decentralized system and can invest in getting them better. Second chunk is user education. So right now, figuring out how to do stuff in Farcaster is hard if you're a new developer. If you just go to Google, type in Farcaster, you land on Farcaster XYZ, and whether you want to learn about like what is Farcaster, how does this thing work, or whether you want to figure out how to stand up a hub, or whether you want to figure out how to pull data from a hub, it's not easy. Like you can get to it. There's like 4, 5, 6 clicks that will take you from that homepage to there, but it's kind of not easy. And so a simple investment in like a nice landing page, kind of like what Ethereum.org says, which is like, hey, this is what Farcaster is. Here's a few clients. If you're a user, here's 3 clients you should go and try to start with. If you're a developer who wants to run a hub, here's where you go. If you're a developer who wants to read data and build applications, here's where you go. And just kind of like a simple launch point for people to go and do stuff, I think would dramatically increase the discoverability of stuff on the protocol. Third priority for us is giving developers more freedom to implement new ideas. We already had a bunch of conversations around this like notion of Turing completeness, which is linked in this doc. And we have a lot of like to-dos in terms of things we want to work on. Paul's already started work on the flexible schemas component. We actually had the first Farcaster proposal, which I'll talk about in a second. But we have a to-do list of things that we want to work down here, which I think is going to let each individual app developer be able to do more interesting things with the protocol and extend it beyond what it currently does today. Point 4 is around app-driven signups. And I think there's two components to this. One is we want apps to have more freedom to bring on users. Like right now, everybody comes through Warpcast and Warpcast controls it, and that's great. But we actually want like, hey, if a new app has figured out a new niche to go after users, they shouldn't really be restricted on how they can get to bring in users. And there's a few ways we can go about achieving this goal, right? There's a cheap way, which is to say, hey, Warpcast, like right now, just give all app developers a large number of invites and let them bring on people. As long as they're not bringing on like, armies of bots, I think it's reasonable to let app developers onboard new people to the ecosystem, and that makes it easy. More decentralized but more complicated approaches involve things like, hey, actually build like an invite service infrastructure that allows apps to directly talk to the smart contracts and invite people. So they don't have to go through Warpcast. They don't have to wait for Warpcast to get an invite. They can just go and do this directly. This takes more work and moves us away from working on other things like some of the Turing complete stuff. But it's something that gives apps like more confidence that they have control over that flow. And the last approach is just go to mainnet. Just go to mainnet, make it permissionless, and then the fact that there's a cost to register will automatically make it unlikely that bots sign up, and so everybody can go and do this stuff. But the downside is that we then add the cost of signing up to users right now in the early days, which has its own trade-offs. Second category of chunks is like second chunk of stuff is reducing application reliance on Warpcast. So this is the general idea that if Farcaster can develop an app that allows signer management from an arbitrary wallet, which is like, hey, this is an app that you can run on your desktop or in your browser extension, and it can store your identities and stuff. It could actually work with any different application. And so you don't necessarily have to rely on Warpcast having this like wallet application that everyone has to auth with, but you can just rely on, hey, there's a neutral Farcaster app, all of our clients can connect to this and so on. This then lets everybody just focus on becoming like high-level applications. There's another approach, which is every application like Discover and Jam and Yup all lean into building their own wallets and say, hey, we actually want to own this wallet layer. Will actually help users like own this entire wallet, own this entire seed phrase inside of our application, and we'll do all the management work. That's more work, and users have to think about porting this between applications, but that's another path that we could go down.
Just as a point here, I think, and hopefully people can hear me. I think what we're trying to prioritize, and this is where feedback, whether public or kind of in DMs and things like that, each of these things ends up being a lot of work. And while all of them would be really nice, like the prioritization is really, really critical. And I know Vern's going to talk about a couple of other things, but like specifically these three buckets up top, I could make an argument that each one of them has a material impact on developers building on top of Farcaster right now that aren't Warpcast. And just given that onboarding does come through Warpcast today, I think each one of these three things above, like there's a reasonable argument to say that this is actually the single highest priority thing that we should be doing for the ecosystem. But we can reason as much as we want about this. But I think feedback for people actually building things is the most useful thing here.
Yep. The last 2 points just to round this out are like long-term data storage. I think apps are already starting to store historical data. Warpcast implicitly maintains this as a backup in case there's an issue with Hub, so it can rebroadcast data. Greg's indexer, I think, is already starting to store some of this stuff. And so if we don't really have a standard format for how data is preserved, users can run into trouble when migrating content between servers or like reading this older data. And so either figuring out an archive format for snapshotting data and backing it up to a file and having this canonical historical record, or extending hubs to store longer durations of data while the network is still small. The last point is actually like driving revenue to fund the ecosystem. I think at some point Farcaster will have to have a revenue stream to continue to exist independent of Warpcast and independent of all the other apps in the ecosystem. And so the path that we've talked about before, which I think is the one that makes the most sense, is to apply a fee for storing data on hubs. So you get to store a very small amount of data for free. If you're a user who wants to store larger and larger amounts of data, there's some proportional fee based on how much data you want to store on hubs. And this establishes a pattern for Farcaster earning revenue, which can then be used to fund a bunch of other protocol improvements. So like Dan said, just to echo, this is how we're thinking about stack ranking these priorities right now. But I think there are arguments to be made that some of these things are more or less important, and we'd love to collect that from everyone in the community, either now on this call or asynchronously on the discussion forums or on Farcaster itself. Cool. I'll pause here to see if anyone wants to make any comments about this before we jump on to the next topic. All right, let's keep rolling now. Two other proposals. I'll zoom over these quickly. Would love feedback from folks on them. One is canonical URIs. So the idea behind canonical URIs is everything in Farcaster, when you attach it to a cast, is expressed as a URL. And URLs are like nice in a lot of cases. Like you can point to images, you can point to web pages, you can do open graph embeds. But the user experience gets slightly annoying when you use URLs to represent things that are actually canonically on-chain. Or on a decentralized protocol like casts. So for example, if you do a quotecast in Warpcast today, and you just add a Warpcast link to a cast, and then you write some text above it, and you go and open that up in Discover or Jam, you get the cast and you get a Warpcast link. And if you click on it, being like, I want to see what this cast is, you get booted out of the app and taken to another app. And that's super annoying, right? Like Discover and Jam probably had that cast inside there, and they would like to have just taken you to that cast page. And so rather than representing casts and NFTs and other on-chain actions as URLs, there's this notion of like, hey, let's represent them as URIs. So like, if you just say, this is a Farcaster cast, here's the hash of the cast, then each application can freely go and say, okay, I have a representation of this, I'll render it internally, or let me go find a URL from some third-party service to show the user. And so this proposal addresses that. It's got a couple of things here. One is it's sort of a general standard for how do you define different identifiers. So there's a notion of HTTP stuff, which covers links on the web. There's a notion of chain stuff, which covers links on Ethereum and can be easily extended to other blockchains. And there might be more things like how do you define locations and so on that we want to add over time. So this spec defines both the first two protocols that we want to support in casts, as well as a more general structure for how to propose new changes and new protocols so that they can all work in a backwards compatible way. It's not a breaking change to the protocol. It's sort of a soft opt-in. Every client, it's up to every client to ingest this and to sort of adhere to the specification.
One thing to add here, and I think we're going to develop this relatively soon, is the default behavior for clients getting built is if you don't understand an embed, just, like either ignore that cast and or, have a fallback or whatever. But I think like we don't want to make it so that all clients like have like X amount of time to support a given embed. Like this should start to feel more experimental and permissionless, and clients should just kind of have some default logic that like if someone's putting something weird in the embed, that's actually completely fine, because we want developers to actually be able to try out new ideas and things like that.
Yeah. Bill, in terms of FIPs, like I'll talk about this one specifically, and then others. So there are like what I think of as like breaking changes and non-breaking changes. So I think non-breaking changes are things like canonical URIs. It's a standard. You can adopt this. If you don't like the standard, you can propose a new standard, and each client can opt in and out. And it's fully backwards compatible, right? There's no like, if you put a cast that has a URI that doesn't adhere to the spec, it's still accepted by the hubs. It's just other clients may not adhere to it. Kind of like how ERC 721s work in Ethereum. It's like there's a specification, but you don't have to adhere to that. You can change properties and you can do things differently, but you should then expect that it may not show up in OpenSea the way you expect it to. So this isn't in that category of proposal. And so the way we think about this is it's not really a voting process similar to ERC. It's you can roll this out, you can make the proposal, and then clients are free to adopt it or not adopt it. If it's a bad proposal, someone else will come up with another proposal that's better, and everyone will adopt that standard and so on. I think there are some breaking changes that might affect like the way the protocol works. So I think the second FIP, which Paul is working on, which actually affects how the URIs can be used, not just as embeds in casts, but actually as pointers. So for example, you can have a reaction to a URI, which is a reaction to an NFT, or you can have a reaction to something, or a reply to an NFT and things like that, which allow you to annotate content on all these blockchains. That's actually like a backwards compatible breaking change, which means the clients actually have to upgrade the format of the protocol, decide how, make some changes to how things work and so on. And in those cases, we want to be a lot more thoughtful about how we do this. We want like some level of community consensus around like, hey, everyone thinks this is roughly right. The major clients feel like it's going to work and everyone's on board. Or if there's pushback or suggestions on how to do it differently, we want to incorporate them in that design. We don't have a formal process for approval yet. I think the community is small enough that it's going to be casual. It's going to be like, talk in the Telegram groups, vote on this proposal forum, and then move forward. And over time, we can expect it to get a little more formalized in terms of like actually collecting votes from the major folks. I do think, to be clear, this is going to work a lot closer to Ethereum and Bitcoin and less like a democratic voting process, which this is not a, hey, every user on Farcaster gets to vote on every protocol change, because some of these are deeply technical topics. It's going to look a lot more like application developers can and technical users can weigh in, and then the Farcaster core team, which is everyone who has commit access to the repo, can choose whether or not to incorporate this into the protocol specification.
I think two other things to think about this is one, the kind of like governance of the core repos over time probably get more decentralized, and there's probably some more formal structure. But I think while we're still in this really early phase, like we want to optimize for velocity and momentum, and that probably means a smaller group of people making decisions. And I think once we've gotten, a couple dozen FIPs under our belt and like we really understand, okay, like where are the hangups on this process and kind of like where are the areas that can really slow down or whatever, I think we can continue to iterate. And like once we know how this works really well, we can kind of start to think about like, okay, well, what is a long-term governance structure of this? Because obviously you don't want to get to a situation 3 or 4 years from now where all of a sudden just the big companies being built on top of the Farcaster protocol get a say in what it gets at. That's effectively what happened to email, right? And in some ways the web. So I think like we're conscious of like there's potential for capture here long term, but for the near term, I think like what we want to do is optimize for velocity and getting a lot of input on things from a core group of developers who are actually building the early applications.
Yeah, I think I'm also thinking about how can we simplify the process to get inputs? Because when I was reading the last proposal about the canonical URI, which was put maybe a week ago, I found it was a bit hard to go through all the content and all the discussions on GitHub, because the initial post was very long, and then there was also a few sort of follow-up discussions after that. So I'm just thinking out loud here, but maybe it'll be helpful to have some sort of digestible digestible way to let people know what this proposal is about, and then it will be easier to discuss it directly on Farcaster instead of on GitHub. Because then I have to switch to GitHub, read everything, and then try to follow the discussion. I think there's some friction there, which was why actually I read the whole thing, but I still didn't sort of comment on it because it took so much time for me to even just go through all the discussions.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, and that's very good feedback. And I think one of the things that Paul and I were talking about yesterday, I think we realized that there's like 2 phases in the evolution of an idea. And this kind of happens in Ethereum too, right? There's the like ETH Magicians forum where someone posts an idea and kind of goes back and forth, and it's this long discussion thread that maybe a few small people work on and kind of finalize the idea. And then there's okay, the idea is ready for proposal, and this is like a fixed idea, in which case it should actually be a formal like spec that adheres to some format or standard that's easy to parse and read. and do that. And so I think right now we kind of did both in the same forum, but I think going forward, we're going to be a little more deliberate about like, hey, this is the discussion stage, and this will be long and messy, and we may go back and forth. And this is the proposal is finalized stage, where like, hey, we actually have a tangible thing that is, here's how we want to build it, that you can say yes or no to. And I hope that will address some of the concerns that you raised, because we felt the same way about the process.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think it would be great if we bring some of this discussion to Farcaster instead of on GitHub.
Yeah, I think we'll try to post it in both places. We want to maximize like both discoverability and sort of historical source of truth on this. But I think maybe the right balance is to post it on GitHub and then bring it to Farcaster and then broadcast it. And I think we shared this out this morning as well. So hopefully there'll be some good discussions on Farcaster.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions on this before we move on? Great. The second proposal is what Paul's been working on, which is the notion of supporting arbitrary targets for embeds, parents, and reactions. I think this is still a little earlier in the discussion phase, so this proposal is a little bit longer. But Paul, do you want to give like a quick high-level overview of how you're thinking about this, just so we can start collecting feedback from everyone on whether this design works for
them? Sure. So yeah, I guess the distinction between the two is a little bit murky, but one is like, this one is about making, from a protocol perspective, the way that hubs represent messages, making it so that casts can reply to arbitrary things and reactions can react to arbitrary things, and casts can embed arbitrary things. And so the list right now in the protocol, or the way the hubs work, casts can embed just strings, and then they can only reply to other casts, and you can only react to other casts. And so this is sort of a proposal to allow you to make all those things the same sort of data structure, either a string or a cast ID, and make it so it's also upgradable. So if there's another kind of structured thing we want to be able to reference in the future, we can do that easily. The changes for replies and reactions were sort of already contemplated when we did the first release of hubs. So we designed the protobuf messages so that we could easily add more types. So that's a pretty straightforward upgrade to make. Unfortunately, the one around embeds, which is sort of what the URI spec was referring to, is a breaking change, because we didn't think about like, oh, we want to embed, a cast ID or some other structured thing. You can only embed a string now. So this proposal just goes through the changes to the protobuf messages. And then there's a comment down below that's, I guess, linked in this, linked in the initial message, but a comment about how clients would have to support multiple types of embeds as we do the upgrade. But it's also worth mentioning, this is a proposal that affects basically how hubs are written and how hubs consensus consensus works. And the first one is more a standard for how clients would interpret information that the protocol is giving them. So there's slight nuance there. And so we all sort of have to, in order for Farcaster to work, we have to agree for something like this, how hubs are going to handle this different types of information and which protobufs we support. And for the first one, it's beneficial for us all to agree, all clients to agree on which URIs to support and how to render an NFT versus something else. But you can also, from a protocol perspective, it's totally fine if some client makes a new URI format and just starts using it. There's nothing actually preventing that.
Cool. And just to recap on this, I think the question posed to developers around this change is like, one, what this change will allow is it's a protocol upgrade that's going to allow casts, reactions, and embeds to contain pointers to either other casts as sort of these efficient cast IDs or to generic targets as strings. And embeds are going to have to be upgraded in a slightly backwards and compatible way, where old casts generated before a certain point in time will have this like deprecated embeds field, and new casts generated after a certain point in time will have a new embeds field. And so clients parsing it will have to deal with a little bit more complexity while these two things live side by side, which is for a year until casts expire. But the benefit is you now have a much better way to define and point to all these different data structures. Cool. We will probably share a more formal version of this proposal in Farcaster for comments, but I think that the meat of it is here and all the important like upgradability aspects are captured here. All right. Moving on, we have a community call again this week, 5 p.m. Pacific on Clubhouse. Dan's going to post the link on Farcaster closer to the time, so watch Farcaster for the link. Wanted to also quickly touch on Warpcast developer updates. So the thing that we've been focused on is like hub integration. That's been the #1 priority, which Tony and Shane on our team have been working on, which is making sure that like state between the Warpcast apps and the hubs are fully in sync. So now when you delete a message on Jam or other things, that state is like propagated exactly onto Warpcast. And like it works like 99% of cases, but there's still the last 1% of tail cases that we're chasing down and making sure that things are working smoothly. The second thing is we're working on web client, so bringing feature parity to web client, some improvements. There's still a bunch of work to be done to actually include all the things that desktop does, so that's the last push for this month. And then the third thing, based on the canonical URI spec above that we just talked about, Warpcast is going to start publishing NFTs as canonical URIs. So if you as a user share like an NFT, you know, whatever form that takes, it's actually going to be included in the embed as that new canonical URI, and then other clients can decide whether they want to show their own rendering of the image or whether they want to convert it into an OpenSea link, which you can do with a regular expression and embed it, or whether you want to use a completely different service. It does require that clients are, as people start using these new canonical URIs, like Warpcast can add an NFT embed, somebody else might add a different transactions, for example. Clients are going to have to get smarter about, hey, I'm going to look at this embed and I'm going to see the protocol or what type of embed it is, and then I'm going to make a decision based on whether I can render it or not. If I know it and I can render it, great, I can just show you the embed. If I don't know it, I can show you the text and maybe an unknown embed, or I can decide not to show you the thing at all because it's a type that I don't understand. But I think the thing that clients should not do is render the text and then give the user no indication that there's an embed, because that can change the context of the message itself. And that's something that I think would get confusing for users. So clients will have to start factoring this into their casting going forward. Warpcast is planning to do this. If there's any reason that this might cause breakage or problems for your clients, let us know. But we're planning to ship this either later this week or early next week.
And I think it goes back to the point I said before is, you know, first time, I think we're a little bit more flexible here, but we should get to a point where when you're building a Farcaster client, like the embed is something that you have to have logic to be able to handle. And that should start to get as permissionless as people want to experiment. And clients should just be smart enough to kind of fall back to levels of graceful fallback that makes it nice for users. And yeah, I think like that should just become a default expectation, because that actually will make the protocol a lot more permissionless in terms of people coming up with interesting new ideas for embeds.
Cool. Any questions in the Warpcast roadmap before we close out the meeting with the shout outs and help wanted? KMac, the question is, did you say embeds could have a 721 token URI resolver? So the way the embeds would work is you can just have, there's this standard called CAPE, or the chain agnostic improvement protocols. And it has a standard for, hey, here's how you can canonically specify an NFT. So it would have a chain ID, which says, hey, this is on Ethereum mainnet, followed by the contract address, followed by a very specific pointer to which token ID you're using. And that's the way that we will embed like an NFT into a cast. So you can then say, oh, I'd like to use OpenSea to render this, or I have images in my database and I can render this, or something else entirely.
There's also a nice thing here where, like, as these embeds grow, and let's just use NFTs for an example, I could imagine one of the NFT API companies comes in and says, great, we can handle all of your Farcaster embed stuff. Here's this little like SDK or library. And so I do think this improves over time, but for the early days, it's going to require a little bit more just kind of like manual, like, okay, here's my implementation or handling. And you know, an Ethereum NFT, like, we don't have near-term plans to add Tezos. But if someone adds Tezos and it starts to get popular in a different client, then that can potentially dictate, like, for us to say, yeah, okay, well, X percentage of these embeds are coming across and we can't show them really well. But going back to the point that Varun made, the simple thing for us is then, okay, let's add a regex that says at least link to the OpenSea equivalent for Tezos, right? And so I think that there's like nice ways to make this easier to support. And so I'm very, very bullish on embeds, because I think it's an area that Twitter experimented with early, and then they just changed strategy. They actually had an embed that you could arbitrarily sign up for any email newsletter pre-Substack, and they just like never invested in it. And so I actually think it's an area that, like, letting developers get creative with what they want to show with users and or potential interactivity with it gets pretty cool.
Yeah,
Cool.
I have one quick question for y'all. Totally agree that the embeds is a super powerful thing. And the arbitrary targets, do we have like a timeline on that? I know the proposal is new, but I feel like that's going to unlock a lot. So I'm just kind of curious about how you guys are thinking about prioritizing that piece of everything with everything else you got going on.
So there's two components to how this will get rolled out. I think the first thing is just a standard to say, hey, an embed, which effectively is a string today, you can go in and put in a different kind of string that says hand pointing to an ERC 721. You could, right after this call, start publishing things in that format, and then each client has to like implement a way to scan and render that, which will take, you know, some amount of time. Workcast clients do that pretty quickly. Gem and Discover will probably take some time to implement that as well. The second component is slightly different, which is, hey, we want like reactions and replies to be able to point to NFTs, which will be rolled out with the next major protocol upgrade, which Paul can speak to the timelines, but it's like at least 6 weeks away. We plan to like ship these major upgrades every 6 weeks. There's also a subcomponent to that, which Paul touched on earlier, which is that right now embeds are just strings, and we actually want to make an upgrade so that embeds can be strings or these highly efficient cast IDs, so you can store casts in that efficiently. That will also be grouped with that change. So NFT, putting an NFT into a post is something you could just go straight up and do tomorrow. Replying to or reacting to an NFT will probably take like 6 weeks before it's supported at the protocol level.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarity there.
Yeah, and one other thing, just to like emphasize on these arbitrary targets, you really start to actually move Farcaster beyond just like the instantiation of like a feed app like Workcast. Like, basic example, every page on Etherscan has a discuss comment box. That's obviously not natively integrated in a protocol level anywhere, right? Like, it's just a third-party service that just says this arbitrary page, you can do some comments. But you can imagine that anything within Ethereum, for example, now has a native like conversation that can be attached to it. And so you could permissionlessly pull that in a block explorer. You can permissionlessly pull it in anywhere you would have that Ethereum transaction context or NFT or anything like that. And so I think it becomes a pretty powerful composability component with, like, again, just not only just Ethereum, any arbitrary URL, any other chain. And so I think it's a that we're really excited about from protocol level, because I think it helps to show that Farcaster is not just about being a Twitter clone. And like, I think that was the instantiation that we took with the initial Worldcast app. But I'm optimistic that like the more that these kind of low-level primitives exist at the protocol level, developers' creativity is actually just going to go wild, and that is a really cool.
Yeah, totally agree. It enables permissionless discuss, basically.
Exactly. Cool. So lots of shout outs this week. I won't go through them all in detail, but a ton of folks, including some people on this call, helped us test hubs. So thank you all for that. We also have 2 new utilities, Hub Web, which we talked about earlier, which is the browser-based hub client, and also HubPy, which is an early Python hub client that lets you talk to a hub directly and broadcast messages to a hub, which you can follow along with. It's not yet fully complete, but it's got kind of all the basics. And I think Berta is open to PRs for that. And then thanks to Zach for helping test and find some bugs in gRPC web and a bunch of PRs for documentation issues. There's also PRs from other folks on this call, like Satyajit, that we haven't merged in yet. So thank you all for submitting that stuff. And we're working through all the code reviews and getting all the good stuff merged in. Last topic, help wanted. So a few things. One is if you're running an app that's still using Warpcast API, we'd love to get you migrated over to Hubble. And if there's a reason you can't fully start using Hubble APIs, we'd love to talk to you and understand what that is. So I'm going to ping some of you directly if you're still using the Warpcast APIs to learn what we can do to get you to using the hubs. Second thing, if you're not running a mainnet hub, if you're on testnet, or if you just haven't spun up a hub yet and you have cycles to help us run a hub, that would be super valuable. We're looking for a lot of feedback on different networking environments, different configurations, and making sure that this thing works through all different kinds of firewalls, port mappers, and the whole networking stack. So that would be tremendously useful. And the last thing is there's a ton of issues left on the Farcaster hub. You can kind of go here and take a look at it. There's a lot of stuff marked with ready, which can be easily picked up. There's some stuff marked with help wanted that still requires design, but there's a lot of stuff here. And based on your interests, we are very open to contributions from all levels, starting from documentation all the way to big meaty changes to the protocol. Cool. That brings us to the end of the call. I'll pause one more time to see if anyone has any last questions or topics they want to add. And if not, we will wrap for the day.
I just want to make a very quick comment and say that if you make contributions to the hub repo, you will also be eligible for rewards from Purple.
Yes, that's right. Purple's giving out bounties for all developers working on the ecosystem. Awesome. Thank you all, folks, and we'll call that a wrap and see you all here in a couple of weeks.
Thanks.